Okay. Good evening. We are. Who else is ready for some Star Wars? I'm ready for some Star Wars. I am not gonna game tonight. I'm tired, so I'm just gonna do the reading and watch an episode of something, chill out, and go to bed early. So, but we're gonna finish Skyborn tonight because it's pretty short. Um, but I'm not gonna get into another of the Lost Tribe of the Sith tonight, though. I'll just do this one and we'll call it. So, here we go. Chapter 3. On her third day among the newcomers, Adari learned to talk. She'd spent the first full day after the terrifying encounter asleep, if that was the right term for a feverish nightmare slumber interrupted by brief patches of delirium. Several times she'd opened her eyes only to shut them quickly on seeing the strangers hovering around her. But they were tending to her, not harassing her, as she'd found the second morning, awakening between an impossibly soft blanket and the rough ground. The newcomers had found a secluded dry spot for her, with several figures sitting vigil. Adari had drunk the water they offered, but it didn't restore her voice. Her head still rang, her mind bruised by the earlier assault. None of her vocabulary came when called. She had forgotten how to speak. Corson was sitting with her when she finally remembered. He'd called over Hestus, a rust-colored figure with a shining mask covering part of his acid-scarred face. It almost looked like it was part of his face, various bits hiding under his skin. Adari had flinched in fear, but Hestus had simply sat calmly listening to Corson try to talk with her. And they talked, awkwardly at first, with Hestus piping in occasionally to repeat a new Kashiri word she had said, followed by his own language's equivalent. Adari had marveled. The Kashiri words Hestus spoke sounded exactly like what she'd said in her own voice, even. Corson had explained that Hestus's special ear gave him that talent, helping to speed along the exchange of information. Adari was interested in that exchange, but most of the information had gone the other way. She gathered that the people Corson led had indeed come from the silver shell, and that it had somehow fallen from the sky. It was also clear that, powerful as they were, they had no means of leaving the mountain now, isolated as it was by water and forbidding terrain. Corson had listened with interest as she spoke about Kesh and the Kashiri of Uvak and villages on the mainland. She'd mentioned the Skyborn only once, before stopping in near embarrassment. She didn't know who the newcomers were, but she felt abashed bringing it up. Now, on the third afternoon since her arrival, Adari was speaking comfortably with newcomers, and had even picked up some words in their language herself. They were something called Sith, and Corson was human. She repeated the words. "You're a good listener," Corson said, encouraged. He said others had worked with her as she slept. He did not say how, to try to improve communications. Now they were progressing quickly, and it was not all their doing. Even overwrought, Adari remained sharp. "Our immediate concern, Adari Val," Corson said, emptying a glistening pouch of powder into a cup for her, "must be to reach the mainland. There wasn't food or shelter enough for his people here, and the mountain had sheer drop-offs to the sea below. Her Uvak might have provided an exit for someone, but Nink, as fearful of the newcomers as he was of the mountain's native wildlife, had spent the last few days far out of reach above." Drinking the broth, it was filling, not unlike her mother's stew, she thought. Adari wrestled with the problem. Nink might come when she called, but only if she was standing in the open, alone. She could fly to land and return with help. I couldn't take any riders, though. Nink might not appear if she was accompanied, and a novice rider would never carry a passenger in any event. Could never. I've had to go alone. I'd have to go alone, but I'd return as soon as I could. She will not? Adari knew the voice before she even looked up. The screamer. The mother of the small child charged toward the smoldering campfire. "She will abandon us!" Corson rose and took the woman aside. Adari heard heated words exchanged, unfamiliar ones. Bidding the woman away, he spoke words Adari did recognize. "We are her deliverance, and she is ours." Adari watched the woman, still glaring at her from afar. "She doesn't like me." "Sela?" Corson shrugged. "She's concerned over her mate, lost from the crash site, and with a child she's anxious to leave this mountain." He smiled, offering to help Adari stand. "As a mother, I'm sure you understand." Adari gulped. She hadn't mentioned her children. She'd barely even thought about them since she arrived among the newcomers. She realized. Shaking her head in guilt, she revealed something else that the Kashiri might not listen to her. Corson seemed unsurprised and unruffled. "You're smart, Adari. You'll make them listen." He gently wrapped her shoulders with the azure blanket she'd slept beneath. "Keep this," he said. "The sun's setting soon. It could be a cold ride." Adari looked around. Sela stood in silent fury, unmoved from before. The others Corson had introduced eyed their leader nervously. Red tentacle-jowled Ravelin exchanged a worried look with Hestus. Even the hulking Gloyd, who, despite his brutish appearance, was clearly Corson's greatest ally here, shifted uncomfortably. But no one barred her from leaving their campsite. When a strong hand did stop her at the edge of the clearing, she was surprised to see whose it was. Corson's. "About the Kashiri," Corson said. "You told us about Tav, your town. It sounds a good size. But how many are the Kashiri? How many Kashiri are there in all, I mean?" Adari answered immediately. "We're numberless." "Ah," Corson said, his posture softening. "You mean they have never been counted?" "No," Adari said. "I mean, we don't have a number that large." Corson froze, his grip on her arm tightening. His dark eyes, slightly smaller than a Kashiri's, focused on the wilderness beyond. She'd never seen him unnerved. If this was it, it lasted less than a second before he stepped back. "Before you leave," he said, finding a tree to lean against, "tell me what you know about the Skyborn." Corson had called the vessel he arrived in Omen. The word not only existed in the Kashiri tongue, but was the long-held favorite of the Neshtavar. Watching what was happening now on the plaza known as the Circle Eternal, Adari guessed even the Uvok-riding chiefs were realizing the irony. She had returned to Corson for a single day, one full week after Omen had collided with the mountain and with her life. It had been a simple matter for her to attract the Uvok riders there. As soon as the patrol spotted her and Nink, they followed the whole way to the Katajan, I don't know, Satajan range. The place had been the scene for several surprises in recent times, but none trumped the moment when the Neshtavar came upon Adari standing defiantly amid 240 supportive visitors from above, almost every one signaling his or her presence with a glowing ruby lightsaber. She didn't have one of the strange devices, but she glowed just the same from within. Adari Val, collector of rocks and enemy of order, was now Adari Val, discoverer and rescuer, answerer of the mountain's call. Add profit to that, she thought, as she watched the dozen score visitors come hobbling from their ordeal, enter the Circle Eternal. They passed between gawking, silent crowds of Kashiri, many of the same people from her door the week before. Ahead in the circle, all the Neshtavar in the region were present, more than she'd ever seen. 3 days of aerial rescue operations had brought the newcomers off the mountain, days in which the world had gone out far into the word had gone out far into the hinterlands. The Skyborn had arrived on Kesh. No lesser reason could explain why the riders compliantly took their positions not in the Circle Eternal itself, but along the raised perimeter. The villagers had watched Adari's hearing from here. Now the Neshtavar were watching her in the circle, marching along behind Corson. Behind them, the visitors filed in, forming their own inner perimeter over which the Neshtavar strained to see. Isri Daj looked small, standing beneath the columns 3 times his height that served as the sundial's gnomon. Normally, it made him seem larger. Not today. He limped forward and greeted Corson and company with mawkish words of praise before turning to the audience. Straining to see over the lines of visitors, Isri made the declaration official. These were the Skyborn, he said, come down from the very mountain from which their servants had brought back the law centuries earlier. It wasn't the same mountain, Adari knew. Perhaps the text would be changed later, but Isri ignored the detail for now. The visitors had established their identities to the satisfaction of all the Neshtavar, he said. You didn't believe them when they levitated your cane? Adari whispered, unable to resist. That ended when they levitated me, Isri rasped under his breath. He turned back to see the villagers cheering, not for his proclamation, but for Yaru Corson, Grand Lord of the Skyborn, who had just physically leapt the distance to the top of the column. When the cheering finally died down, Corson spoke in the Kashiri words that his interlocutor had honored Adari Val, the honored Adari Val, daughter of the Skyborn, had taught him that morning. We have come from above, as you say, he said, deep voice carrying to all. We have come to visit the land that was a piece of us, and the people of that land, and Kesh has welcomed us. More cheering. We will found a temple atop the mountain of discovery, he continued. We will be many months in labors there, tending to the vessel that brought us and communing with the heavens, and in that time we will make our home here in Tav with our children, aided by the Neshtavar. who were such good stewards here in our absence. They will leave here today, taking wing to all corners of Kesh to spread the word of our arrival and find the artisans we require." He spoke over the applause. "We are the Skyborn, and we will return to the stars." Happy chaos. Adari's younger son, Tona, squirmed against her. She spied her mother and Finn at an honored place just outside the circle, beaming happily. Adari looked up at Corson and swallowed hard. It was all so perfect, and all so wrong. Chapter 4. The rapturous mood of the Kesh lasted straight through moving day. The Skyborn had been quartered in the fine homes of the Neshtavar while the riders spread the word. As the Neshtavar returned one by one, their guests uniformly declared their preference to remain in the relatively sumptuous accommodations. After the sixth rider appealed to Isri, the elder declared that all riders should move their families to humbler homes, that the Skyborn might know their devotion. Corson and Sela had been living in Isri's own house since the first day. Everyone moved but Adari. For her service to the Skyborn, she'd been allowed to remain in Jari's house. It also kept her near Corson, whom she saw daily in her informal role as ambassador and aide. She saw all the prominent Skyborn daily. Gruff but amiable Gloyd, who was something called a hook. Hestus, busily indexing the Kashiri vocabulary, and rust-colored Ravelin, who often seemed lost, a minority within a minority. She also saw Sela, who had installed herself in Corson's lavish lodgings. Sela's child was Corson's nephew, Adari learned. Sela always glowered at Adari when she was around Corson, including today, as Adari stood with him at a dig on the edge of the Satajan range, in sight of the ocean she fled to a month before. The Skyborn needed structures to stabilize and protect Omen, but first they needed a clear land passage onto the peninsula. A route was taking shape with the Skyborn, whose number included many miners, hewing huge chunks of strata with their lightsabers. "Sabers will do better when we recover some of the lignin crystals to power them," Gloyd said. Corson presented a rock sample to Adari. Granite. The efforts were not for her, of course, but she'd always wondered what was below. Now she knew. "You were right after all," Corson said, watching her study the stone. She hadn't mentioned her conflict with the Neshtavar, but she'd been anxious to confirm her theories with someone who knew. Volcanoes did form new land, and the mountains of the Satajan range weren't volcanoes. While granite did come from magma, they told her it was formed far underground over the course of eons. That was why its rocks looked different from the flamestones. "I don't understand half what my miners tell me," Corson said, "but they say you could easily help them if you weren't helping me." Corson began speaking with Gloyd about their next project, a dig to find metals necessary to repair Omen. Adari started to interject when she saw Sela orbiting. Adari shuddered as the woman passed from sight. What had Adari done to earn such hatred? She's not staring at me, Adari realized. She's staring at Corson. "I saw you," Adari blurted to Corson. "What?" "I saw you a second time on the mountain that day. You threw something over the side." Corson turned from his work. He gestured, and Gloyd stepped away. "I saw you throw something," Adari said, swallowing. She looked down at the ocean crashing against the cliffs. "I didn't know what until you sent me to return to the village." Corson stepped warily toward her. Adari couldn't stop talking. "I flew down there, Corson. I saw him below on the rocks. He was a man," he said, "like you." "Like me?" Corson snorted. "Is he still there?" She shook her head. "I turned him over to look at him, and the tide swept him away." Corson was her height, but as she shrank, he loomed. "You saw this, and yet you still brought the Neshtavar to find us?" Adari froze, unable to answer. She looked at the rocks far below, so like the ones farther up the range. Corson reached for her as he had before, and drew back. His voice softened. Your people turned on you to protect their society. You were a danger? How did he know? Adari looked up at Corson. He looked less like Jari all the time. I, I believed something they didn't. Corson smiled and took her hand gently. That's a fight my people are familiar with. That man you saw, he was a danger to our society. But he was your brother. Corson's grip tightened for a moment before he let go altogether. You are a good listener, he said, straightening. The fact wouldn't have been hard to learn. Yes, he was my brother, but he was a danger, and we had dangers enough when you found us, he said. He looked deeply into her eyes. And I think this is something you know something about, Adari. That same sea took someone from you, too, didn't it? Adari's mouth opened. How? Jari had died there, but the Neshtavar would never have told Corson. Speaking of a rider's fall, broke their greatest taboo. Falling was being claimed by the other side. No one had seen it happen, save for Nink and the all-seeing Skyborn. Corson was either a mind reader or he was who he said he was. His words barely came out. Her words barely came out. It's not the same. You pushed that man. I didn't have anything to do with what happened to my... Of course you didn't. Accidents happen, but you didn't mind that he died, he said. I can see it in you, Adari. He was a danger to you, to the person you're becoming. Corson's bushy eyebrows turned up. You're glad he's gone. Adari closed her eyes, putting his arm around her shoulder. Corson turned her toward the sun. It's all right, Adari. Among the Sith, there is no shame in it. You would never be what you are today with him keeping you down, just as you'd never be what you're going to become with Isri Daj keeping you down. At the name, Adari's eyes opened. The sunlight dazzled her, but Corson wouldn't let her turn away. You were afraid of us, he said, and afraid when you saw the body. You knew we'd die on the mountain if you didn't bring help. Yet you brought the Neshtafar anyway because you thought we could help you against them. He released her. Adari looked blankly at the sun for another moment before looking away. Behind her, Corson spoke in the soothing tones he'd used when his voice had first reached her on the wind. Helping us interact with the Kashiri is not just about helping us, Adari. You will learn things about your world that you never imagined. He turned over the rock in her hand. I don't know how long we're going to be here, but I promise you will learn more in the next few months than you have in your entire lifetime, than any Kashiri has. Adari shook. What do you... A simple thing. Forget what you saw that day. Corson made good on his word. In her first months with the Skyborn, Adari had learned much about her home, but she had also learned some things about where they had come from and who they were. She was a good listener. By simple things we know the world. Corson's Sith were the beings from above that she denied. But they weren't the gods of Kashiri legend. Not exactly. They had amazing powers, and perhaps they lived in the stars, but they didn't bleed sand, and they weren't perfect. They argued, they envied, they killed. The Sith did read minds to a degree. Corson had used that to call out to her for help after seeing her in the air. But they weren't omniscient. She'd found that out with a simple, surreptitious experiment involving Ravelin. She'd suggested he visit a restaurant deep in Tav's busiest quarter. Off he went, getting lost in the same neighborhood she always got lost in. The Sith's perceptive powers were amazing, but they still required accurate knowledge from others. She sought to provide that, accompanying Corson to many work sites, mostly employing jovial Kashiri laborers. The Skyborn were perfect enough for the Kashiri, and perfect enough for her. Yaru Corson was as far beyond Jarival in intellect as she was above the rocks, and as long as she learned to avoid the eye of Sela, another widow of a fallen man, she could expect to learn a great deal more. At the same time her knowledge advanced, Isri's faith was further glorified. She took little joy in that, apart from the occasional chuckle she got from having a more storied role in it than he had. She was the discoverer, always to be remembered by Kashiri society. No one would remember Isri. Watching another quarry being constructed, she wondered what that society would look like. She knew something the Sith didn't. They'd be here for a long time. She'd mentioned it once to a miner, who promptly discounted it as advice from the local know-nothings. But she knew. The metals the Sith sought weren't in the soil of Kesh. Scholars had scoured every part of the continent. They had recorded what they'd found. If the substances Coruscant's people required hid further beneath the surface, it would take time to find them. A lot more time. Time the Sith had. What, she wondered, would the Kashiri have? And that is the end of Lost Tribe of the Sith, Skyborn. So we will leave it off there. And that will be the whole session. I am not going to game tonight. Wow, that wasn't even 30 minutes. But that's cool. We'll just make it a short one, and we will pick up the next book. Let's see, Lost. Oh no, we actually have two of the Fall of the Sith Empire comics next. Issues 4 and 5 to finish out that miniseries, which kind of, this stuff fell in between. So yeah, we'll finish up one of those on Friday and the other one on the following Monday, because Wednesdays I'm doing Star Wars readings, but I'm doing short stories. This is by request. I'm doing short stories, and right now I'm reading Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina. So Wednesday will be the second story in that book. I don't remember the name of the story, but that'll be that. And then Friday we'll get on to Fall of the Sith Empire issue 4. So, all right, we will see you then. Have a good night.